What would you do? You paid for a first-class ticket, you step onto the plane, and someone is already sitting in your seat. Not great. Now, what if the flight attendant, instead of helping, asks you to move? For one man in a story that has electrified the internet, this wasn't a hypothetical. It was the start of a showdown at 30,000 feet that pushed the limits of dignity and respect. The story goes that a quiet, successful black CEO named David Langston was backed into a corner. But instead of giving in, he made a single phone call that brought an entire airline to a grinding halt. Now, let's be clear, credible news outlets haven't verified this specific incident with David Langston as a factual event. You won't find it on the evening news. But that hasn't stopped the story from captivating millions. Why? Because while the details might be the stuff of legend, the injustice at its heart is painfully real. It's a story about what happens when subtle prejudice meets immovable resolve. It's about the power that comes not from being the loudest person in the room, but from knowing your worth. So, stick with us, because the way this flight ends is something no one on board would ever forget. Hook, in 5 minutes, I was going to ground the whole airplane. It wasn't because I'm a vindictive person. It's because when a woman stole my first-class seat and the flight crew sided with her, I had a choice. And I chose to teach them all a lesson in respect they would never, ever forget. Section 1, The Calm Before the Storm. The late-night hum of the airport was a familiar soundtrack for David Langston. At 45, the black CEO of a thriving tech firm, he'd spent more time in airport lounges than his own living room some years. This flight home to Dallas was the last hurdle of a brutal week. Meetings in Arizona had dragged on, each a high-stakes negotiation that demanded everything he had. All he wanted now was the quiet comfort of his window seat, 2A. David wasn't a flashy guy. He moved through the world with a quiet authority that didn't need to announce itself. Dressed in a simple gray polo, dark jeans, and comfortable sneakers, he could have been anyone. No designer logos, no massive watch. The only thing that gave him away was the confidence in his posture, the way people just seemed to make a little more space for him. He'd learned a long time ago that true power isn't loud, it's just present. It was a hard-won lesson. David built his company from a cramped garage with nothing more than a big idea and an iron will. He'd walked into boardrooms where the investors' eyes slid right past him, assuming he was there to bring coffee, not deliver the pitch that would secure their funding. He remembered the subtle put-downs, the patronizing questions, the quiet shock that a black man could be the visionary behind such a sophisticated company. He met every one of those moments not with anger, but with a calm, articulate brilliance that left no room for doubt. Tonight, though, he wasn't looking for a fight. He was just tired. Waiting in the first-class lounge, he scrolled through headlines on his phone. An article caught his eye. Another airline CEO was apologizing for a series of booking fiascos. David let out a dry chuckle. They never learn, he muttered to himself, having no idea how right he was about to be. When his flight was called, he felt a wave of relief. He tossed his coffee cup, grabbed his jacket, and headed for the gate. As a first-class passenger, David's group was called first. He showed his boarding pass and walked down the jet bridge, the soft thump-thump of his carry-on wheels behind him. That seat, 2A, wasn't just a seat. It was a small sanctuary he'd earned. It represented thousands of hours of grinding, countless sleepless nights, and the will to succeed when the world didn't always make space for him. But as he was about to find out, peace was not on the itinerary. Section 2, The Inciting Incident. David stepped into the cool air of the plane, gave a polite nod to the flight attendant, and turned left toward first class. His eyes went right to his row, looking for that little pocket of peace by the window. And then he stopped. He blinked, thinking his tired eyes were playing tricks on him. There, in his seat, 2A, sat a woman. He'd seen her at the gate. Late 40s, maybe early 50s, with perfectly styled blonde hair, a cream-colored blazer, and pearl earrings that screamed old money. She had an air of casual entitlement, like someone who couldn't imagine a world where she didn't get exactly what she wanted. She'd already made herself at home, her handbag tucked away, sipping a glass of sparkling water as she scrolled through her phone. David stood in the aisle for a moment. He was a logical man. There's probably a simple explanation, he thought. Maybe she's confused. Maybe the gate agent made a mistake. Years of navigating predominantly white spaces had taught him that patience was his most effective tool. He took a slow breath and leaned in slightly, keeping his voice even and friendly. "Excuse me," he began. "So sorry to bother you, but I think you might be in my seat." The woman looked up, a polite smile on her face that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Oh, I don't think so," she said, her tone light but firm. "This is my seat. I always sit in 2A. David clocked that word, always. A strange claim on an airplane where seats are assigned flight by flight. He kept his own smile in place. "I understand, but my boarding pass says 2A. Would you mind if I saw yours, just so we can clear this up?" The woman's smile tightened. It was a tiny, fleeting look, but it said everything. It was the look of someone whose authority had been questioned, and she didn't like it one bit. "I don't think that's necessary," she replied, her voice losing its sweetness. "I'm settled. Perhaps you should check your ticket again. Maybe you're in row 20, not row 2. The jab was obvious, and it was a familiar sting. The casual assumption that he, a black man in a polo shirt, must be the one who was wrong. That he couldn't possibly belong here. He felt that old, familiar heat rise in his chest, an anger he'd learned long ago to control. "Ma'am," he said, his voice becoming purely factual. "My ticket is for this seat. Seat 2A. He held up his phone, the screen clearly showing his name and assignment. "I'd appreciate it if you'd check your boarding pass so we can resolve this." She glanced at his phone for less than a second, a theatrical flicker of her eyes, before taking another sip of water. She didn't reach for her bag. She didn't look for her ticket. She just turned her gaze back to her own phone as if the conversation was over. As if he was dismissed. The message was no longer subtle. She was stealing his seat, right in front of him, armed with the belief that her desire to be there simply outweighed his right to be. The standoff hung in the air. David stood his ground in the aisle. The woman in his seat, let's call her Caroline, kept scrolling on her phone, putting on a masterclass in acting unbothered. Other passengers were starting to notice. Murmurs rippled through the cabin. Sensing a problem, a flight attendant emerged from the galley. She was young, with a bright, plastered-on smile. "Let's call her Kelly." "Is everything all right here, sir?" she asked, her voice cheerful, but directed only at David. "Almost," David said calmly, relieved. "It seems there's a mix-up. This passenger is in my assigned seat." He showed Kelly his phone. Kelly glanced at the screen, then at the seat, then at Caroline. "Ma'am," she began, "looks like there might be a little confusion. Could I please see your boarding pass?" Caroline let out a loud, dramatic sigh. Finally, she pulled her own phone out of her designer bag. Kelly looked at Caroline's screen, then back at David's. Her professional smile faltered for just a second. "Ah, I see," she said, handing the phones back. "It looks like your ticket is for seat 4F, a lovely aisle seat 2 rows back." Then she turned to David. "And sir, your ticket is indeed for 2A. David nodded. "Great. End of story. So if you could please ask her to move, we can get on our way." But Caroline didn't move. She crossed her arms. "No," she said flatly. "I'm not moving. I have a bad knee and I need the window. It's more comfortable. Besides, I'm already settled." Kelly looked flustered, caught between the rules and a difficult passenger. Her training should have been clear. Instead, she took the path of least resistance. She turned back to David, her smile now strained and pleading. "Sir," she said, dropping her voice to a whisper. "I understand this is your seat. But the other passenger has a medical concern. Seat 4F is also first class. Would you be willing to be flexible and take that seat? It would really help us get the flight out on time." David just stared at her. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. She was asking him to move. She was asking the person who was right to accommodate the person who was wrong, just because she was making a fuss. The injustice of it was breathtaking. This wasn't about flexibility, it was about surrender. It was about asking him, the black man, to make himself smaller so a white woman could be comfortable in her entitlement. "No," David said, his voice quiet but iron firm. "I will not be moving. I booked seat 2A. I expect to sit in it." The cheerfulness instantly vanished from Kelly's face, replaced by a flash of annoyance. Her tone shifted, becoming condescending. "Sir, we don't want to cause a scene. It's just a seat. For the sake of the other passengers, please, just take the other seat. Don't cause a scene." The phrase hit him like a slap. He was the one being wronged, yet he was being painted as the troublemaker. Just then, a more senior flight attendant, a man named Mark, stepped out of the galley. "What's the problem here?" he asked, his eyes landing immediately on David as the source. Kelly quickly explained, framing it as David's refusal to cooperate. "He won't take the other available seat," she said. Mark's face hardened. He looked David up and down, his gaze lingering on the casual shirt and sneakers. The unspoken judgment was thick in the air. This wasn't how he expected a first-class passenger to look, and so, this wasn't a passenger who deserved the usual respect. "Sir," Mark said, his voice dripping with authority. "You are holding up this flight. Either take seat 4F, or we'll have to ask you to deplane." The threat was now on the table. Comply or get kicked off. David looked at Mark's stern face, at Kelly's anxious one, and then at Caroline, who was watching it all unfold with a smug, triumphant smirk. She'd won. The crew had picked her side. They had looked at a calm black man and an entitled white woman, and decided who the problem was. Underneath a deep, weary disappointment, something else began to harden. A cold resolve. They had all made a very, very big mistake. Section 4, the turning point. For a long moment, the cabin was suffocatingly silent. David could feel every eye in first class on him. He could feel their impatience, their judgment. In their minds, he was just another angry guy holding up their flight over something as silly as a seat. He felt that familiar pressure to just give in, to be the reasonable one, to swallow his pride so everyone else could be on their way. He'd felt it 1,000 times before. In boardrooms, where his ideas were ignored until a white colleague repeated them. In stores, where security guards followed him while he shopped. In all the small ways he was asked, again and again, to prove that he belonged. He could take the other seat. Walk 2 rows back, sit down, and the whole ugly mess would be over. The flight would take off. Caroline would have her victory. The flight attendants would congratulate themselves on handling the situation. And he would spend the next 2 hours fuming, tasting the bitter humiliation of backing down. He would have taught them nothing, except that their biases work. Or, he could stand his ground. Not with shouting. Not with anger. He looked at Mark's hostile face, Kelly's anxious one, and Caroline's victorious smirk. And in that instant, his exhaustion burned away, replaced by an ice-cold clarity. This wasn't about a seat anymore. This was about dignity. It was about refusing to be erased. He thought about the young black and brown engineers he mentored at his company. He thought about the speeches he gave, telling them to be bold and claim their space. What kind of leader would he be if he didn't live by his own words? The decision settled on him, not as an act of anger, but as an act of profound self-respect. He wouldn't just refuse to move. He would change the entire game. He looked Mark directly in the eye. "I've heard your request, and I've heard your threat," he said, his voice dangerously calm. "My answer is no. I will not be taking seat 4F. And I will not be deplaning." Then, before they could call security, he did something they never saw coming. He calmly placed his carry-on in the overhead bin above seat 2B, the empty aisle seat right next to his. He took off his jacket, folded it neatly, and placed it on his bag. Then, with a quiet confidence that radiated through the cabin, he turned to the indignant Caroline. "You have 5 seconds to move," he said, his voice a low murmur that carried the weight of an ultimatum. 5, 4, 3. Caroline gasped. "You can't," but David had already turned away. He stepped into the row and sat down in seat 2B, the aisle seat, directly next to her. He buckled his seatbelt, pulled out his phone, and looked straight ahead, as if she didn't even exist. The cabin was electric. Mark and Kelly were stunned silent. They had no script for this. Caroline was sputtering, her face turning blotchy red. "He can't just sit there. This is unacceptable. Do something." David ignored her. He unlocked his phone. He had one call to make. A call that would show this airline exactly who they had just disrespected. The turning point was over. The consequences were about to begin. Section 5, the phone call that changed everything. The first-class cabin was frozen. Caroline fumed in the window seat. Mark and Kelly whispered frantically in the galley, their authority completely gone. Passengers were now openly staring, their phones held low. And in seat 2B, David Langston was perfectly calm, his focus entirely on his phone. He didn't need to look up the number. It was the direct line for his company's corporate travel liaison. His company wasn't just a client of this airline, it was one of its largest corporate partners. Their contract, worth tens of millions of dollars a year, was the lifeblood of several key routes, including this one. He pressed the call button. It was answered on the second ring. "This is David Langston," he said, his voice low and steady. "I need you to connect me with Mark Sanders in legal, and then patch in Patricia Webb, the Senior Vice President of Operations. It's an urgent matter regarding our corporate agreement." The names he dropped were top executives. Using them was a signal that this was a 5-alarm fire. While he waited, Mark the flight attendant approached again, trying to sound forceful. "Sir, I don't know who you're calling, but you are interfering with a flight crew. That is a federal offense. Turn off your phone." David didn't even look up. He just held up a hand, a quiet gesture demanding silence that left Mark speechless. Just then, the call connected. "David?" "Patricia Webb. What's going on?" Her voice was sharp, alert. "Patricia, hello," David said. "I'm on flight 832 from Phoenix to Dallas. I'm sitting in seat 2B. He paused. "Although my ticket is for 2A. He then laid out the events with cold, factual precision, the passenger in his seat, her refusal to move, and most damningly, the crew's response. He named Kelly and Mark. He recounted their threats to have him removed. "Your crew," David stated, "chose to support a passenger who was in the wrong, and threaten the passenger who was in the right. A passenger whose company has a multi-million-dollar contract with you. This isn't a customer service failure, Patricia. This was an active, biased decision to disrespect me and my company." From the galley, Kelly's face had gone ghost white. Mark stood frozen in the aisle. They were finally understanding. This wasn't just some guy in a polo shirt. Now, the legend of this story says there was a mythical, clause 3.4, in the contract, giving David's company the power to ground a flight. While that's likely an exaggeration, the power David held was just as real. He was the man who decided if his company would renew a contract so valuable the airline couldn't afford to lose it. "Patricia," he said, "my company spends over $20 million a year with you. In return, we expect a baseline of respect. Your crew failed to meet that baseline. So here's what's going to happen. I am invoking our executive service level guarantee. I want this aircraft returned to the gate. I will not fly on this plane. And we will be having a serious conversation about our partnership on Monday morning. The silence on the other end was heavy. He could almost hear the frantic calculations of the financial and PR nightmare unfolding. David. I am so sorry, Patricia finally stammered. This is completely unacceptable. Let me speak to the captain. Don't move. I had no intention of moving, David said softly, and ended the call. A moment later, the cockpit door opened. A grim-faced pilot emerged and made a beeline for the galley. The conversation was hushed, but his furious gestures told the whole story. Mark and Kelly looked like they'd seen ghosts. The game hadn't just changed, it was over. Section 6, The Grounding. Less than 2 minutes later, the captain's voice came over the intercom, stripped of its usual warmth. Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain. Due to an unforeseen customer service issue, we will be returning to the gate. We apologize for the delay. A wave of groans swept through the plane. But in first class, there was a stunned silence. All eyes were on David Langston. He hadn't yelled. He hadn't made a scene. He made a phone call. And with that one call, he'd stopped a Boeing 737 in its tracks. As the plane lumbered back toward the terminal, Caroline's smugness dissolved into pure rage. She turned to David, hissing, "What did you do? Who do you think you are? You've delayed this whole flight because you couldn't just take another seat." David turned his head and just looked at her. He didn't say a word. There was no anger, no triumph. Just a quiet finality that was more chilling than any comeback. His silence told her everything, her privilege, her pearls, and her outrage meant nothing here. She had picked a fight with the wrong person. She seemed to shrink back into the seat, defeated. As the plane docked, a gate agent and a grim-faced airline executive in a suit boarded. The executive, let's call him John Miller, walked directly to row 2, avoiding David's gaze. "Mr. Langston, sir," he said in a mortified tone.